Hello and welcome to HKA Talks To. Today we are joined by James Hargrove, who is a member of Orrick's International Arbitration Practice Group based in Geneva and also with an office in London. James, welcome.
Hi Chris, thanks for having me.
Thanks very much for joining us. I guess to start, it would be helpful for those that don't know you, if you can just give a brief overview of your practice, the type you're involved in at Orrick.
Yeah, with pleasure. So I'm a partner at Orrick. I've been with the firm for between 2 and 3 years now. I split my time between London and Geneva, in both, and I'm part of our integrated international arbitration and international litigation team, focusing among other things on international construction disputes, and we've got people dealing with complex international construction dispute management in the States, in Paris, in England, in Geneva, in Germany, and in Milan.
So truly global.
We try.
So we know that COVID-19 has had and continues to have a major impact on construction and engineering projects worldwide. And Charles and I were just curious as to what issues have your clients typically been dealing with so far?
Well, I think it falls into 4 categories of issue that's been keeping them very busy. The level of business has regularised itself a little now, and I think a situation of real heavy concern, analysis and reactivity has evened itself out into perhaps a more standardised situation in relation to dealing with delay and disruption and force majeure issues around these things. But those 4 things that have come up that are certainly, globally applicable. First of all, responding to the events. So the events being typically site work and access and people power issues, and equipment supply and supply chain disruption, both of which have dramatic effect in terms of delay and disruption on projects. Second category of workflow that we've had is drafting assistance, and that itself splits itself into various subcategories. So you've got prospective projects, drafting, front-end draft, document drafting process, new force majeure clauses, particularly thinking about pandemic resurgence, thinking about whether your force majeure clause is wide enough, broad enough, or specific enough to deal with pandemics, mutations, etc., etc. You've got the fairly acute issue of contracts which are about to be signed, NTPs approaching, and contracts therefore being changed. We've seen some very lengthy and tricky discussions between contractor, employer, and financing parties. Different levels of flexibility up the chain or down the chain, if you like. So there's reactivity, changing probably almost agreed force majeure clauses to make sure that this sort of disruption is taken account of. And one of the big issues, of course, being making sure that where you can start getting not only schedule relief but damages as well, and costs, which might not always be the case in relation to force majeure. Then you've got people consulting, the third category, people consulting us in relation to notice activities. And what I saw at the beginning was not quite panic, but great concern about how to track all the different notices that need to be filed across lots of different countries and lots of different situations. And so we were asked to see if we could draft pro formas, see if we could do a one-size-fits-all, etc., and to help in fairly short order. And then the advice on what and what isn't a force majeure, and whether standard form contracts, amended standard form contracts would apply in a particular situation. And that went through the process which we all have come to know and put under the microscope very carefully now, about identifying the force majeure event. It isn't just the existence of a virus, it's the existence of a virus that actually causes a delay and disruption. That's one of the issues that needs to be dealt with. The repeated advice to the client to go back to the force majeure clause, as a broad generality, pandemics are fitting within most existing force majeure clauses in relation to this specific drafting or the catch-all drafting, but absolutely not always. And then all of the other full range of issues you've got around force majeure. Well, of course, you've got notices, you've got all the notice obligations, which has been a very heavy burden in relation to this particular problem, and mitigation as well. So all of those things, and then reactions, extensions of time, change orders, activating mitigation, and all the rest. So all those things, and I think a lot of people have been dealing with all of those, but those are the things we've been dealing with very regularly.
I'm sure. That's speaking about issues with your clients, but are you seeing any changes to how your clients express their needs to, or how they interact with you as a practice while the pandemic has hit? And if there are any changes, do you see that there'll be a continuation of how that interaction is made after the pandemic, or do you see things snapping back to as they were?
Yeah, there's probably two bits to the answer to that. Number one, interaction with my clients being A, lawyers, and B, the project teams. Construction clients are pretty well set up to deal with this, generally speaking. You know, they are diligent loggers of information, correspondence, communication. They were all using WebEx and such like things before. So for a business sector that's been able to deal with remote working, it's worked well. Mm-hmm. Changes, more video conferences, more time on the phone. More video conferences dealing with things where you would be sitting together. So, for example, it feels difficult to work one's way through the more complex phases of dealing with a firm like HKA on a delay and disruption project, where you'd normally sit and in a room for some days together, and instead you've got to do things over the video conference, and that's tough, and we're learning to do that together, and there is a loss of efficiency, and things are taking a bit longer, and that sort of merges into the arbitration aspect of things. So clients are interacting but dealing with these new ways of doing business along with the lawyers, and there are inefficiencies and things are taking so much longer. That needs to be that needs to be actively fixed into the schedule for getting things done, and it's affecting arbitration timeframes as well.
Yeah.
So James, you sort of touched on the fact that your practice has got a significant international element to it, touching various jurisdictions. And we're just curious as to understand sort of how have you seen those different jurisdictions react? You know, is there anything unique to each? And if so, you know, can we sort of expand on those to sort of try and get a better understanding? Yeah, well, it is different in different jurisdictions. Some things are the same and some things are not. I mean, the contracts are. International construction contracts, of course, have some distinct similarities, and there may be broad distinctions between civil law jurisdictions and common law jurisdictions, for example, in relation to how people might deal with and understand force majeure subjects. Some jurisdictions, for example, will be more used to having force majeure applied where you've got an extremely onerous contractual situation, whereas in our common law world, just because it's difficult to perform an obligation doesn't give you a right to force majeure frustration normally. There are other regional variations. So, for example, in England, as we all know very well, there was a big issue in relation to whether something was a change of law or just guidance in relation to worksite attendance difficulties. And that's happened in a number of countries. It's happened in England. You've got problems with getting damages if change of law isn't applicable, depending on what your contract says. So there are dialogues like that going on in some jurisdictions. English situation was not a change of law, it would appear, and guidance rather than something different. But in other countries, of course, people have been ordered off site. Different measures have been undertaken in order to deal with things different ways. I have seen, for example, depending on which party you're dealing with, on a project level, cooperation, employer, contractor and subcontractor cooperation, understanding the challenges that have occurred. I've seen some different
approaches from finance parties in relation to sympathy for difficulties that contractors have incurred. I've seen some pretty robust approaches emanating from the US. I've seen some rejections of force majeure notices which appear good, depending on who's receiving them. But as a generalisation, the issues that are arising are global in their approach, I think.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to talk to you a bit about hearings, specific, obviously remote hearings, which are a la mode at the moment, understandably. I wonder if you or your team have conducted hearings remotely over video link, and if so, how did you find the experience? What were your observations on the way the tribunal responded, style of advocacy, issues dealing with expert evidence, etc. I'm just curious to get your view on the kind of merits and dismerits of it.
Yeah, well, it's a hot topic. Actually, the first issue, even before you get to hearing, is how arbitrations are going and are things getting delayed and suspended, and what's the approach. And there's a very interesting practice emerging within key arbitrators, I think, which is a pretty healthy degree of scepticism as to whether hearings should be pushed off just because of difficulties and fears and concerns and inconveniences and attrition on getting the job done. And arbitrators are pushing back on that. And they are communicating between themselves a level of scepticism and at least testing the reasons why delays might be necessary. In terms of hearings, yes, like most people, we've done them. We're used to them anyway in some aspects of it, because most advocates have cross-examined or at least seen evidence provided in some manner by video conference over the years. But it was the isolated example, and received wisdom that it was very difficult to cross-examine somebody by video conference, etc., etc., etc. There are many war stories around, and we've experienced personally significant problems. We're talking about certain service provider platforms failing completely, right. Hearings being stopped, and the arbitrators saying, let's try this other platform. In actual fact, with that platform, the parties involved even said, are we worried about the potential confidentiality issues being since it was actually Zoom? They thought about it and they used it voluntarily, everybody agreed. And that delayed that hearing by several hours because it was a complete mess. And there were people, of course, with different bandwidths from different jurisdictions who couldn't get the video link, etc., etc. And this is the problem of the adaptation of arbitration to these things, to fully using virtual hearings for these processes. I have also been involved with and had others tell me about expert processes, and I've had discussions with some experts recently who've been involved in what they think being pretty naked guerrilla tactics by use of using the video conferencing platform, being, for example, people creating gaps in the conversations and saying they can't hear things in order to take more time, speak to their clients, etc., etc. The problem is it's being less regulated in its use, because theoretically before you might have some witnesses coming in by video conference from abroad, and you'd have another lawyer there making sure that proceedings were occurring in the right way because it would be an isolated event. Now you've got a rather less strictly policed environment, which can sometimes cause some problems. And then you've got issues about providing documents, putting them on screen, sharing them, etc., etc. In the end, it means these things are taking longer, and people are not, advocates are not feeling, generally speaking, of course, that they can have the same presentation or cross-examination experience.
So do you think when the free movement of people is allowed a lot more in certain jurisdictions, we will have a snap back to something pretty much like it as it was? Or do you think that there will be a bit of reluctance from some parties in this idea that actually, well, okay, there are obviously benefits in bringing people together and having people face to face, but there are lots of advantages and efficiencies when things properly get into the swing of things, that actually the remote working might continue a little bit more? Or do you think that it will go back to something like we had originally?
I think we'll see service providers doing things like the IDRC are doing in Fleet Street with Opus 2 and other secure environments and very well-connected platforms, providing specific phone lines, etc., and connections for really impressive hearings in the future to deal with this situation, which will have the knock-on effect of making it more possible to deal with hearings in this way, which is excellent for the progress of the dispute resolution platform. So I think it will become more the norm that part of hearings may occur by video conference. But my prediction is that things will not fully, but largely snap back to how they were before. Sure. And even though the courts in England have batted on and are using sophisticated online materials, unlike the courts in many other jurisdictions, they will also snap back. In fact, even more than that, even more than arbitration. The problem ultimately is that in a high-value, complex dispute, both parties, or all of the parties, are going to want to believe that they've had 100% of the opportunity to put their case as well as they can and test the other side. And over the internet, you don't get 100% of the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point, isn't it? I mean, on one hand, I suppose you can say that both parties have got the same contribution or the same opportunity, but of course, yeah, exactly. It's how you use that opportunity, isn't it? So, no, okay, that's a really good point. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, arbitration is a significant investment, and people, business owners and users of the system always want to feel they're doing all they can to win. So I think that we have a long way to go before we're all sitting around as holograms.
First step, perhaps.
Brilliant.
Step on the way.
Great. Well, James, thanks very much for joining us and sharing your insights. That was really interesting.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.